So somebody asked me a question the other day. I'm English. Why do I need to do an English test to get my EASA license? So the first answer to this question is a regulatory answer. So under EASA, under FCL, the Flight Crew Licensing Regulations, there is a paragraph relating to language proficiency, FCL 055. And FCL 055 says, in a very condensed version, that a license cannot be valid unless it has a language endorsement either in the country in which the flight is being conducted or in English. So it is entirely possible, as was my case in the beginning, to have, for example, a French PPL with just French language proficiency. And without that proficiency, the license would not be valid. Now, obviously, no pilot is going to learn and pass tests in every single European language, so by default, the standard is English. Obviously, before Brexit, when UK was part of EASA, the UK satisfied this requirement just by giving all British pilots an automatic level 6, either on the basis of a radio telephony test or on the basis of a flight test. Now, since the UK has left EASA, and British pilots can now enjoy the massive nirvana of arousal that one derives from having a beautiful blue passport in their pocket. It does, however, mean that the UK's way of responding to language proficiency is now no longer accepted by equivalence by other EASA licensing states. So when you ask another EASA state to issue you a license under FCL 55, they have to ask you to demonstrate proficiency in English. The other reason why native English-speaking pilots are also required to take an English test for their EASA license is more of a cultural one. Now, you might think, well, I'm English. Obviously, I speak English. I don't need to prove it to anybody. Yes, presumably, if you're English, you speak English. But the real question is, do you speak internationally understood English? And speaking English in England with English people and speaking English across the world with pilots and controllers for whom English is not a first language are two very different things indeed. So to illustrate this point, let's take an imaginary scenario. Let's take an average British flying club pilot who's decided to take some French conversation classes. So let's imagine our British pilot. Let's call him Rupert Biggles. And Rupert Biggles has just finished his PPL. And in preparation for his first big adventure to Le Touquet, he's bought himself a leather jacket, a Poulies kneeboard, an Armani flight bag. He's also invested in 6 months' worth of beginners' French conversation classes in the church hall at Poshton-on-Sea. So phrase book in hand, Rupert goes and sits down on the terrace at a cafe in Le Touquet just after he arrives, ready to order his first coffee. The waiter comes over and he says, "Un petit kawa, ça vous dit?" When Rupert did his French conversation classes, he's probably learned to say something like, "Je voudrais un café s'il vous plaît," or just "un café s'il vous plaît," because he's only learned one way of saying something. He's learned a stock phrase. As soon as the conversation goes away from the stock phrases that he's learned, he is completely lost. Now, that situation is the situation in which a lot of non-native English-speaking pilots find themselves when communicating with pilots who are native English speakers or L1 English speakers. And this situation arises because a lot of native English speakers don't realise what it's like to only know one way of saying something. In your head, you might have 5 or 6 ways of saying, "Would you like a coffee?" So you might say, "Do you fancy a coffee? Can I interest you in a coffee?" So in English, it could be the same thing. And international communication is all about the people who have a broader vocabulary being able to restrict their vocabulary so that more people can understand them. So let's take a few examples of real things I've heard British pilots say to French controllers when speaking to ATC. "There's a couple of zones ahead of us. Can you let us know whether they're hot or cold?" So this message was particularly idiomatic in the sense of it's something you might hear in a British English-speaking environment. So there's a couple of zones. Would it be easier to say there is restricted airspace? Of quite possibly, because it's a more simplified way of saying it. The next one is, can you let us know? We're using what we call a phrasal verb. Let somebody know something. Now, somebody who's only a level 4 on the ICAO scale might not be very comfortable with phrasal verbs. So instead of saying, can you let us know, it might be easier to say, can you tell me? And are the zones hot or cold? That's very British-specific vocabulary. So it would probably be better to say, if we take the whole sentence, we can see some airspace on our chart. Can you tell me if it is active? Another example. We've got a bit of an engine issue. We're going to take up an orbit. We'll keep you advised. So again, we can simplify a sentence like this by using a much more restricted vocabulary and range of grammar. So instead of saying, we've got a bit of an engine issue, we could say, we have an engine problem. We're going to take up an orbit. A couple of things here. We're gonna is obviously a contraction of we are going to. In a situation like this, it may be easier to say just we need to hold. So we very clearly indicate that we need to do something. Take up an orbit is very British English. And even in America, I'm not certain most controllers would understand that. So we have an engine problem. We need to hold. Simple messages, but the message gets across the first time rather than the second or the third time, which might be the case if the pilot was to use over idiomatic language. So the use of English for international communication is quite a vast subject, and it's a bit of a hot topic in the aviation English community in general, because in most countries, if you're a first language English speaker, it's more or less assumed that you're going to achieve a level 6. But let's not forget that the ICAO criteria relate to communication with the whole aviation community. And the whole aviation community has a very varying level of English. So it's a subject that could fill hours if you really wanted to. But to summarise, there are a few things that particularly British pilots flying in France and other European countries can do to make their lives a little bit easier. First thing is to avoid using phrasal verbs wherever possible. So things like, let me know, get airborne, things like that. The second thing is to avoid using what I would term filler phrases. So things like a bit of, a slight, a little bit. Things which don't really add anything to the clarity of the message. And the third thing is to avoid using anything that's really specific to the UK. So things like basic service, traffic service, those things which just don't exist outside of the UK. But also things like take up an orbit. So there we go, a few reasons why even native English-speaking pilots in Europe are required to do an English exam. I hope you found this video useful. Speak again soon. Bye-bye.